Thank you everyone for being here. I'm Teresa Cordova, Director of UIC's Great Cities Institute. We represent UIC's commitment as an engaged university. And we are really pleased that Michael Guerrero is here with us this morning, is going to spend the hour with us, and we're so happy. Michael's with the Labor Network for Sustainability and has many years of organizing experience. And I actually meant to have the bio in front of me so I could put it for the tape, all the many things that you've done over the years. But I first met Michael going on 30 years maybe. And so I've known Michael for a while, and the first time that I had the honor of not only meeting him but working with him was on a high-tech campaign that was part of the Southwest Network for Environmental and Economic Justice. And we were working with women who had experienced the poisoning from having worked in the high-tech industry at a point when the industry was not doing anything really to provide any kind of protection for the women who were working in that industry. So we were working with women who were experiencing the physical impact of having been working in an industry where they didn't get the protections. And so this was part of a regional effort across the region of the Southwest Network as part of the Southwest Network Environmental Economic Justice Network. In addition, I worked with Michael on the Intel campaign. And this was a campaign where you had a small grassroots organization, the Southwest Organizing Project, in Albuquerque, New Mexico, been around since late 70s, early 80s, since 1980, I think, to be exact. And this was always a fascinating example to me of a small grassroots organization taking on a transnational corporation, and at that time the largest single manufacturer of microchips in the world. So Southwest Organizing Project had taken on Intel specifically around the issue of industrial revenue bonds, because both the state and an adjoining county in New Mexico, Sandoval County, had given some pretty substantial IRBs. And in fact, I remember Rob Meir, who was part of our UIC's history. I remember him visiting us in New Mexico and saying to him it was unheard of that $2 billion IRB was followed up by an $8 billion IRB. So the issue that we were taking on back then, the Southwest Organizing Project, and I was joined them in that effort, the issue they were taking on was the imbalance between the amount of tax incentive, the size of that package, and how much it was actually costing for each job. So there was a book that came out of that called Intel Inside New Mexico. But what was really significant, and I had a chance to work with Michael in various aspects of this campaign, including sitting down with the various top-level management from the Intel Corporation to sit and talk about what they needed to do really to compensate to the community for this kind of incentive package. Out of that came commitments for a local high school that was then built. There were some commitments around local hiring and some training, and a set of other kinds of examples. But I think what was particularly noteworthy is that out of this campaign, it changed the entire conversation in the region about industrial revenue bonds and the conditions under which you give out those IRBs. Because then the work spread to them getting the city to think about their IRB policies, and to then say, okay, if we're going to give tax incentives, then we need to make sure that we have clawbacks in those, that there are penalties for noncompliance, so that in fact the work continued to act, so that City Council, and actually I did the study for that, changed its policy, and so that when Phillips came to town and then left, as they often do once they get that incentive, they then had to pay back $11 million, which then went straight back into some community projects and went back to the city for distribution. So my relationship with Michael goes back a long time. We have there's many more stories I could share, but I say that to say not only to talk about my connection to Michael, but more importantly to talk about the fact that Michael has been really doing this kind of work for a very long time. Before he was at the Labor Center, he was also with the the Climate Justice Campaign Alliance, and in fact, at one point, I'd even seen at the People's Climate Justice March, we saw Michael interviewed by NPR, interviewed by several news networks, several bloggers picked up on it. So we saw your photograph and some of your news broadcasting all over. And in fact, we put a couple of those onto our website. So if you go to this week's blog, you'll be able to see a writing that you did a few years back, as well as an interview. So Michael continues to be committed. He's just one of the finest individuals I've ever had the pleasure of not only knowing, but being friends with. So I'm so extremely thrilled, Michael, that you're here with us. It's just such a great honor. So thank you for your time.
Thank you for that great introduction. Thank you for that. So it's really special for me to be here in Chicago. Tremendous city, and looking forward to a great weekend here. I'm actually here for the People Summit, which starts today, and also opportunity to visit my good friend Teresa Cordova. I met Teresa, as she mentioned, in between stints in Chicago. A lot of you may not know this, but her roots actually go back to southern Colorado, a beautiful town called Trinidad in southern Colorado, which is a really beautiful place, long history of struggles, worker and land rights struggles in southern Colorado. And she gave some of the background on our work together in New Mexico. And so I'm going to talk about some of that and give a little bit more of the details in today's presentation. My computer just logged out. So I want to thank you all for being here, and I also want to introduce Becky Glass, who's with the Labor Network for Sustainability. Also, she's a managing director for LNS. So this is my new gig. I started 6 months ago, back in September, doing this work. And then just another note for Teresa, just the tremendous work you're doing here at the Great Cities Institute. I know some of the work you've been doing around unemployment, and also neoliberal policies, which we're also going to get into today. So thanks, Teresa, again for having me. So, usually when I present nowadays, particularly to labor unions, trade unionists, I qualify my presentation by saying I'm not a trade unionist and I don't come out of the labor movement. But the history of LNS is one that emerges directly out of the trade union movement. So one of the other founders is Joe Uline. Joe Uline comes out of the steelworkers, grew up in the steelworker movement in Pennsylvania, became an organizer for the unions, and then eventually was the secretary-treasurer of the industrial division of the AFL-CIO. So he held one of the highest elected offices in the industrial unions that includes the steelworkers and several other industrial unions. It was in that capacity that Joe was the representative for the AFL-CIO in the UN Climate Commission. And so he was directly involved in the conversations at that level, and really gained an appreciation and understanding of the serious nature of the climate crisis. And this was several years ago. And when he left the AFL-CIO, he felt that what was needed was to build a bottom-up movement within labor and in communities to confront the climate crisis. And he talks, he's been a tremendous spokesperson, basically saying that labor needs to be part of the leadership of figuring out how we're going to transition out of the fossil fuel economy, the extractive economy that we're working in, into a sustainable and regenerative economy. And I'll speak more to that. So, by the way, Teresa, when I asked her, how much time do I have to speak? She said, 40 minutes. And I said, wow. So usually, at city council, you're lucky to get 3. And nowadays in other spaces, you go to a conference, you get 5 to 10 maybe. And then, of course, usually you go over time. So I thought 40 minutes is just as challenging to figure out as 3. So anyway, I'm going to, but this is great. It gives me time to tell stories, time to go on tangents that, I always, like to get into. And if I see your eyes glazing over, we'll cut it off and go straight to question and answer. How's that? So anyway, so some of the major points, though, I want to make sure that we get to today. One is that, environmental justice and labor alliances are critical to confronting the climate crisis. And I'll go into some of that history, some of the tensions between the movements and within the movements around some of these questions. And then also, there's obviously this moment everybody is talking about, the withdrawal by the U.S. And the Trump administration from the Paris Agreement, the Paris Climate Agreement. And so I call it a Paris-Pittsburgh moment. And what are the opportunities now in the wake of the Paris-Pittsburgh moment with the withdrawal from the U.S.? So anyway, let me dive right into it. But first of all, just to help give a little bit more background as to why, so how I got here, right? So I'm a Micronesian, first of all. Hey, how's it going, Howard? From the island of Guam. So Guam, for those of you who aren't familiar with Guam and Micronesia, Micronesia is a region in the Northwest Pacific, about of 2,000 islands. It's about the size of the United States geographically. Guam is 8 miles by 32, which makes it the largest island of those 2,000. So just to give you a sense of the situation that those islands are facing in terms of climate change and how rising sea levels, acidification of oceans is exactly. And
yeah, I spent 3 years in the Federated States of Micronesia.
oh, okay, yes, yeah, you're definitely aware of the situation there, and and it's already some of the populations are planning for how they're going to move out and relocate to other countries and move their populations. But even before those islands go underwater, which is likely to happen in the next couple of decades, they're going to lose freshwater resources. The acidification of the oceans is having an impact. The last time I was in Guam, they made an announcement. The EPA announced that 6 species of coral were on the endangered species list. That's the first time that that's ever happened. And for those of you who live in coastal regions or have lived in coastal regions or in islands, coral is everything to the survival of the islands. So there's that personal connection for me as to why this is important. But the other thing is that my background is in environmental justice, as Teresa mentioned, and so that's the other thing I tell union people is that even though don't come out of the trade union movement, I'm also not an environmentalist, and some of them breathe a sigh of relief when they hear that, but in the sense that I've never worked for an environmental organization. My background is in community organizing, and the environmental justice work and the issues of environmental justice emerge as community issues. And in the case of the Southwest Organizing Project, they emerged through surveys that we did in the communities and the neighborhoods surrounding downtown, where people identified what they called health and safety issues, quality of life issues, that when we traced it back had to do with polluting facilities in their neighborhoods. So people experiencing health problems, the polluting of the aquifers, the underground aquifers in the community, air quality, all of those kind of things were what people talked about. And during the late 80s and 1990s, we were seeing a lot more of the consequences of industrial development in communities of color primarily. In fact, the one determining factor, the primary determining factor of where hazardous waste sites were sited, the number one determinant was race. Beyond class at that point, everything. So anyway, so we started taking this up as an issue, and it wasn't long before we found out that there were several communities, not only in Albuquerque and New Mexico, but throughout the country that were experiencing similar issues. And so that led to the emergence of the environmental justice movement, which was very powerful at that time in the late 1980s and early 1990s. It also led to the founding of several networks, regional and national networks, focused on environmental justice. And then in 1992, was it? When was Clinton elected? 92, 94. Yeah, so shortly after that, one of the demands of this national movement was an executive order on environmental justice, which Bill Clinton did shortly after taking office, which had good and bad consequences that I can talk about more. But it evolved from there, and one thing that the environmental justice movement was very clear about was that it wasn't just about environment. And this is a struggle that we had with environmentalists for many years during those early years that it can't just be about environment. It had to be an environmental and economic justice agenda. And I remember we would get, folks from the Sierra Club and other environmental organizations starting to come to our office and said, "God, it's so great to see you guys getting involved in the environmental movement." And we'd say, "Well, no, actually, it's the other way around. Our communities have been fighting things like sewer plants and polluting industries and the poisoning of farm workers in the fields for many years. The real question is, are you willing to be part of a broader economic justice agenda that includes environment and environmental justice?" And so that tension still plays out today, in fact, between the environmental movement and the environmental justice movement in particular on climate policy. So anyway, then in 1994, there was another dimension that also emerged, which was globalization. And, Teresa started to speak to this, in particular, neoliberal globalization. So one of the trends we had started to see in New Mexico was basically the pitting of communities against each other for jobs. And Intel was one of the classic examples. So during that time, the high-tech industry was beginning to migrate out of the Silicon Valley and looking to the Southwest to start setting up manufacturing plants. Our first exposure to the high-tech industry was what Teresa spoke to, which was the poisoning of workers in these factories. In fact, there was an organization formed called the Toxic Victims Assistance Corporation, TVAC, which was made up specifically of mostly women that were poisoned in some of the high-tech industries that had already settled in Albuquerque. And really egregious violations, things that you just think would never happen with Trump, you never know now. But, literally workers taking circuit boards and dipping them with their bare hands into trichloroethylene to clean off the circuit boards. Workers that were tied on ropes and, they would dump their toxic chemicals into these pits in the ground, and workers would be lowered down on ropes to scrub those and clean those out, without any kind of respiratory protections at all. So TVAC was actually started by a psychiatrist because workers started going to their doctors, and they'd go to the company doctors, and they would basically say the symptoms were so crazy, their immune systems were starting to deteriorate, they're getting all kinds of health issues, cancers and everything else, but some of the doctors said, well, this is all just in your head because every time you come in, you've got different symptoms. So they started getting referred to a psychiatrist that basically said, who started to name, this is toxic exposure. And there was a real famous case of GTE Lenkert where there was a lawsuit that workers filed against GTE Lenkert and settled. They ended up settling for very little, but also were silenced by an agreement not to speak about that case, which is a real tragedy, I think, for those workers because now they're silenced. So TVAC was set up originally as a support organization for folks that were exposed in those industries. So we started partnering with them at SWAP to, basically get the word out about the hazards of this industry. And as the high-tech industries were moving to Albuquerque, we tried to educate our elected officials about, about this problem. And then, as Teresa mentioned, it was pretty much a great giveaway, and communities were pitted against each other. So Intel was one of the worst examples of this, where they basically told 5 cities, it's like whoever gives us the most in terms of tax breaks, cuts back on your environmental regulations and worker health and safety protections, we're going to commit to a plant for 2,000 jobs. And New Mexico set the bar, right? So we were in competition with Chandler, Arizona, Austin, Texas, Santa Clara, California. No, it was another southwestern city. It might have been Colorado. I can't remember exactly. And I remember, at one point I went to air hearings in Arizona because, they were talking about how they were going to roll back, the legislature was going to roll back their air quality regulations. And I remember talking to one of the Intel representatives there. I said, what you all are doing is disgusting, pitting communities against each other like this. He said, I don't know what you're talking about. We're planning to build in all 5. So what they did was they played New Mexico to get the lowest common denominator, And then they went to Arizona and said, well, can you match New Mexico? And it went on and on down the line, and they continue to build in all these places. In the meantime, we gave away a huge tax base, part of what we're paying for today in New Mexico with huge budget deficits. And this was the basis of the report called Intel Inside New Mexico. Teresa was one of the editors of that. The impact of that industry, and it was very comprehensive. It was well thought out. So it was not only the environmental regulation rollbacks, the worker health and safety protections, but water. We're talking about an industry that uses, I think it was 4 million gallons a day of water in a desert state. So what that meant in terms of water rights giveaways and the impact on agricultural communities in the state. And New Mexico still very much has a thriving acequia system, which is a collective system of governance of water and sharing water resources. So now you have farmers and acequia associations that are selling the water rights to this corporation, and so then losing their land base, right? So it's been a huge impact socially, economically, and environmentally since then. And then that's not even to mention the amount of chemicals that are used in these plants. So anyway, so that was one of the huge reasons why we got involved, not only in environmental issues and environmental justice, but all these other issues in terms of economic justice and worker rights. And then there was NAFTA. So that was the other thing that President Clinton did, was really wheeled and dealed to get NAFTA passed in 1993. And NAFTA was actually one of the last really big multi-sectoral coalitions that was built in the United States. And it was really a disservice, I think, to the movement overall when NAFTA was passed. And for those of you who remember, it was passed partly because there were side agreements that were committed to. One was, they were going to create a North American Development Bank. And the Development Bank was supposed to be set up to basically fund the cleanup of the border region, because all the maquiladora industries that were there were dumping chemicals for years, and so we were starting to see the health effects of that. Places like in Matamoros and Brownsville, babies were being born without brains. There were several cases of anencephaly. And then if you go to the outfalls of the Ford plant and the Reynolds aluminum plant and all these other places, they were going straight into these drainage ditches without any kind of pollution controls whatsoever. And people were living around these plants. The workers actually lived and built colonias around these plants, and so the health effects were were very severe. And the cleanup of the border was going to take a long time and a huge investment. Well, not surprisingly, I think if there's a handful of cleanups that have taken place in the wake of NAFTA going on 30 years, I think that's an overstatement. I think there's been nothing done in that area. The other side agreement was for workers that were going to lose their jobs, because the plan for NAFTA, and let's be clear about this, the plan was that they were going to move in manufacturing facilities to the border region, right, so that people in Mexico would provide the labor force, the cheap labor force. And so what Mexico did was change their constitution, right? Eliminate the subsidies for farmers, particularly for corn farmers, right? And those of you who know anything about Mexico, corn is huge in terms of the culture, the history, the economy of Mexico. The government would buy corn from collective farms in Mexico, and they would sell it out on the world market. So they would guarantee an income for farmers. Well, that article of the Constitution was changed to allow for the passage of NAFTA, which meant that now farmers in Mexico had to compete on the world market on their own against the big agricultural corporations, and of course it didn't happen. That was by design. So farmers are suddenly being displaced. In the case of Mexico, 6 million people were displaced from the countryside since the passage of NAFTA. And where are they supposed to go? They're supposed to go to the border region to work in the factories, right? But then what happened? Then China started opening up, and a lot of those factories picked up and moved to China. So now you have millions of people in the border region that can't go back home because they have no source of income there. And then, so they try to move north. And now, now we see, we've seen the great migration that's taken place in the last couple of decades. And then now, as the U.S. continually tries to seal its borders and persecute immigrants and jail immigrants, then we see the consequences of that. So then what happens, you get internal markets, informal markets and drug trades, which are no longer about trafficking drugs in the United States, but now you have markets in Mexico. And then you see egregious things like women being assassinated and killed, mass killings of women along the border region, and the economies of the border region completely decimated. So those were the impacts of NAFTA, and I think one of the things that that we're seeing with the Trump regime is that they've stolen that narrative, right? And they've made it about, he says Mexico won, right? The U.S. lost in NAFTA, and it's clear that workers and communities lost in the U.S., Mexico, and Canada, for that matter. Farmers have lost, workers have lost. Environmental justice communities have lost in terms of that. But that story is never told. It's like how the impact of Mexico, how migration was created. And instead, again, we continue to blame the victims for the conditions that we're facing in the United States. So anyway, so why that tangent? Well, it's very clear, I think, back then there were coalitions that were built between workers and environmental justice communities with NAFTA. And because of the compromises that were made for the passage, we lost momentum as a movement. But then we saw the emergence of the global justice movement again with the World Trade Organization and the battle in Seattle. So that resistance to the neoliberal agenda has still continued to this day. But the tensions have also exacerbated. And then with the emergence of climate change as a huge issue, it's also helped to exacerbate some of those tensions, but create opportunities for rebuilding some of these coalitions. And that's what I hope to talk about more as we move forward. So let me just say there's some of this history, and it's complicated. I'm going to speak now a little bit from the perspective of the labor movement. People talk now a lot about this term just transition, right? And it was actually, and it's a controversial point within the labor movement. It's interesting because in the Paris Agreement there were actually provisions for just transition, and one of the things that Trump did by pulling out of the Paris Agreement was that basically he eliminated the possibility or the provision that would have helped protect workers as we transition out of fossil fuels. Don't get me wrong, I don't think the Paris Agreement wasn't a good agreement to begin with, and we'll go into that more later. But that was one of the things, is that basically he abdicated that responsibility, amongst others, for workers to be protected in the transition. But just transition is controversial because there's a long history to it, and it's evolved. The definition, the way it's conceived today, has evolved. The roots of it actually go back to the GI Bill, and the GI Bill could be seen as one of those actually a good policy of what a transition could look like. And there were problems with that too. There were a lot of communities of color that didn't have access to those benefits, but the GI Bill provided for 4 years of income and education for soldiers coming back from World War II. And so a lot of civil rights organizations were actually started in the wake of that because they couldn't get access to it. The GI Forum and some of the other African American civil rights organizations were started because of that. But Tony Mazzocchi, who was the head of the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union in the 1970s, was a veteran and was a beneficiary of the GI Bill. And as climate change became the awareness of climate change started to grow, particularly in the 1990s. He said we need a similar program for workers because we know we need to transition out of these industries. And so we need a similar type program. And they would talk about it as, we can't bear as workers an unfair burden in the form of a tax, which is our labor. Everybody has to share the cost of that transition and share the, in terms of that subsidy that we provide as workers. So they called it initially a super fund for workers. Remember, the super fund program was starting at that time for cleanup of communities that the most polluted communities around the country, and they said we need to have a similar program for workers. Later, they changed the term. The oil, chemical, and atomic workers changed it to just transition, and then just transition. The workers, the oil, chemical, and atomic workers, actually did some innovative programs with environmental justice groups, and they partnered in a set of cities in a program they called the Just Transition Alliance. And they did some really innovative stuff where, they talked about being on both sides of the fence line. How do we get folks on, in the community that are being affected with workers that are being affected by these polluting plants? So they would do things like they would do health studies, and they would have a committee of 4 workers inside the plant work with a committee of 4 people in the community, and they would do joint health studies. And the workers would go out and interview people in the community, and the community members would interview workers in the plant on health and safety issues, and they developed a joint agenda to support the workers' rights to organize in the plant, their demands inside, and the workers supported the environmental justice demands outside. Unfortunately, the Just Transition Alliance program pretty much got defunded when OCA got taken over by the paper workers and later the steel workers. So it's really unfortunate because 20 years ago, it was a really innovative program that could have been built up and had a lot of benefits today. But part of the reason, now if you hear like Richard Trumka, he'll talk about just transition as a fancy funeral for the labor movement. And in some of the national union leadership, they say, they just hate the term. And part of the reason for that is they feel that there's never been a good one. There's never been a good implementation of a just transition. And NAFTA, I think, is a good example of that, where a lot of the workers from these industrial plants got left hanging. There was really no transition for them, and we're seeing some of the consequences of that today.
Here in Chicago is an example.
Yeah. So anyway, and then even the green jobs programs that, of the last decade, right? So there's a lot of training that was done in energy efficiency and renewables, but there weren't necessarily jobs on the other end of the line. So it's important to note, so like the LIUNA, the laborers union, where the head of the laborers union in the Standing Rock issue had some really strong words, also in Keystone, really strong words for people who supported Standing Rock and opposed the Keystone XL pipeline, Terry O'Sullivan. But LIUNA supported the Kyoto Protocol and endorsed the Kyoto Protocol, even though the United States did not sign it, right? And then there was the bill to try to pass climate change legislation in the late 2000s, like 2007 to 2009. That effort failed. And shortly after that, the building trades signed an agreement with the American Petroleum Institute, right? And what the American Petroleum Institute has to offer that really left and progressive movements haven't been able to offer is shovel-ready, is jobs. And to say, you can wait around for a just transition policy, but we've got jobs ready to go right now. And it's very complicated. I mean, one of the things people also, I was talking to Joe Uline about this, if you think about construction workers in the unions in the United States, their benefits are dependent on them showing that they've worked a certain number of hours in the last 3 months, right? And so which means that it really forces them to have to take work wherever they can find it, right, to be able to maintain those benefits. So again, it's just a situation for workers in this country. It's tough. And then you're talking about workers that have developed skills, high-paying jobs in some of these industries, and are being asked to either take pay cuts, because one of the things about renewable industries is that a lot of these jobs are not good paying jobs. Some of them don't even pay minimum wage in solar installation and other jobs. And the workforces are not unionized, right? So they don't have those same kind of labor standards that unions can bring. So those are some of the complications about it, and it really just points to the need for us to provide something tangible in terms of the kind of programs that are going to protect workers as we transition out of a fossil fuel economy. Sorry. Yeah, since it's going to be. You know what, let me pause right there, and let's take some questions now, because we're going to be here.
Well, just take one for,
Yeah.
let's take them as they relate to what you're saying, but let's keep it.
Sure.
Because this is a great sort of track, and it's a great history.
Yeah, I don't want to interrupt, but I just think there's so many important things you've said already. You know, so the question is, Osaka was a real hero to us in the 60s, 70s, et cetera, like I'm sure to you. And he personally, I think, really got it in terms of the race question.
Yes.
But most of the other people around him didn't. Yeah. And I think the problem is that we can't deal with just transition without dealing with the labor aristocracy history of racism for 125 years in this country, which still exists. Not so much maybe on the West Coast, but here it's still a huge issue. Right. And most of the places east of the Mississippi. So one of the problems we have with just transition is if you look at the Department of Labor statistics, for example, 3.9% of all the energy workers in all the sectors are African American. About 15% are women, and the only place that Latinos are overrepresented are the most dangerous mining. Same thing is true with Native Americans. So I think the problem is, even if the AFL-CIO was totally behind this, how do you think we're going to deal with this issue, which honestly most of the people, including your organization, I know you're new to it, I just read the paper yesterday. It needs to really be improved on that. And I've talked to Sean and Trade Union for Energy Democracy, and he didn't even have those figures. So how do you think we're going to move ahead?
No, that's a good point. Absolutely. And well, that's why, one of the major themes, I don't know if you're here at the beginning, but the importance of environmental justice and labor alliances is critical, right? Because we do have to overcome that history of also racism in this country, even within the labor movement, because that's one of the things that Trump is doing, is playing off that racism that exists even within the labor movement. So no, you're absolutely right. And one of the things that we need to do is create those pathways and empower people that haven't had access to those good union jobs, right? So that definitely has to be a dimension. So when we talk about just transition, and when I get to that part, how it's being conceived today and how it has to be different, I think is important. So thanks for raising that, because it's actually one of the points I was just about to go into is how the idea of just transition has evolved. Because now it's not even just thought about only as a transition for workers, as we shut down coal plants and oil facilities. So it's not just about those workers, right? Now it's even broader. And groups like the Climate Justice Alliance have helped to broaden the definition of what that means in terms of how we change our economy from being extractive to regenerative. And that includes extraction in terms of not just what we're taking out of the earth, but also extracting people's labor and people's rights, right? So that's how it's being starting to be talked about today. And even some of the international bodies are thinking about it as how can it be much more comprehensive and transformative for economies, because ultimately that's what we need. It's not going to be, in fact, transitioning out of fossil fuels to renewables is not going to be a one-to-one replacement of jobs either. There's not going to be enough jobs in the renewable sectors to be able to replace those. So how do we actually think more broadly in terms of the economy that we actually need to do that? So when we think about it and how we build an economy that confronts climate change, we have to look at all these other sectors as well. And the other thing to keep in mind is that changes are already happening in different sectors in the economy. So renewables and fossil fuels is one, right? So now it's cheaper to produce renewable to build and manufacture renewables. And there's more jobs in renewables now than there is in fossil fuels, right? But we're going to see the same thing in transportation. There's going to be huge shifts in the transportation industry. And with the evolution of car batteries, electrification of cars, and driverless vehicles. Now we see like Uber is going to be going to driverless vehicles. Truck transportation is going to be going driverless. So all of these shifts are going to happen within the next 10 years. And that could mean loss of jobs for a lot of workers as well. Maybe some job opportunities, but also a lot of job loss. We also have to think about the agricultural sector. Because at the end of the day, in order to meet the goal of maintaining the increase in temperatures, global temperatures of 1.5 degrees, we can't just think about a carbon neutral strategy. We've got to think about carbon negative, right? And one of the ways we do that is through agriculture and restoring soils and doing work like that. So the agricultural sector also needs to go through a major transformation. And then public transportation. Right? Obviously, we need more of that and get away from our fossil fuel vehicles as much as possible. So these are just some of the areas that we need to be looking at in terms of how we transition. And what that means is a couple of things, is that we need to think about how we not just protect workers and communities, but in each of these industries, but it's going to have to be broader than that. So even this idea of like social democracy, we need a safety net that's going to be broad. It's health care, guarantees people an income, provide services for people that are going to be displaced, because there's likely to be a lot of displacement, not just in a transition to the fossil fuel economy, but just generally. So we need to be thinking about that as well. Hold on. I keep losing my track here because of my computer going down. But anyway, so why don't I just transition to this point about the Paris-Pittsburgh moment? Because, again, so the Paris Agreement was not a great agreement to begin with. The UN committed to a 1.5 degree goal in terms of increasing temperatures. But there was really no teeth to it. And one of the things that the Paris Agreement did was it created carbon markets, right? So that carbon trading was a way to address the problem. And there are a lot of problems with that, and particularly as somebody who's been involved with the environmental justice movement and indigenous communities in particular. But do people know how carbon trading works and how the system actually works?
I want to say it anyway.
Yeah. So basically what they're saying is that we have to cap global increases in carbon or emissions of carbon. And so if you look at the globe as a whole and the atmosphere, there's a certain limit that we can permit ourselves to emit. But say you've got this factory, let's say there's a refinery, the oil refinery in Richmond, California, right? And you've got in the Amazon, an indigenous community there. The carbon that is being pulled out of the atmosphere in that forest, in the Amazon rainforest, can balance out the emissions that are coming from this plant in Richmond, right? So that's the conception of it. So what they do is create a system of credits where Richmond can say, okay, we're going to buy a certain amount of land from these indigenous people in the Amazon, and that's going to offset our emissions at this plant, right? So there are a number of problems with this scenario. First of all is that the community surrounding the Richmond plant, or communities, are primarily people of color communities that have been exposed to these emissions for many years. That's not going to change because all Richmond did was say we're going to offset that, and that allows us to emit more. And then what happens to the indigenous community on the other end? There's a lot of speculation that's happening, trends like they call them carbon cowboys, where people are going and saying that they're buying land on behalf of these corporations to some of these communities when in fact they don't even have ownership of it. So there's a lot of those kind of scandals that are taking place, and the monitoring of the system is another thing. Even the tracking of the performance of these is problematic. Europe, and this is something that Trade Unions for Energy Democracy has talked about. They've done a paper on this. The system that they have in place in Europe is showing that it's not working, right? And this is what the Paris Agreement was dependent on, was these carbon markets being able to reduce emissions. And clearly that's not a solution. So they're getting away from regulation to what they call a market-based solution. So in a lot of ways, Paris was also another neoliberal type agreement, right? And that furthers, it's a free market fundamental approach to how to deal with the climate crisis. So that's one of the problems with the Paris Agreement. But the opportunity, I think, now with the U.S. actually withdrawing, and there are a lot of bad things about the U.S. withdrawing. The fact that it's Paris at least was a recognition that there needs to be global cooperation, and the U.S. needs to participate in a global system to protect the climate. But now what we've seen since then is cities, states starting to declare that we're going to honor the agreement. We're going to go 100% renewable by 2050. And Pittsburgh in particular, I thought, was an interesting case. I mean, a few hours after Trump announced the withdrawal, Leo Gerard, the head of the steelworkers, wrote a great statement, and put out a blog that talked about what Pittsburgh used to be like before environmental protections were put in place, and the fact that the street lights had to be on all day long because of the pollution that was in the air and how the water was polluted and all those kind of things. And then the next day, the mayor of Paris announced we're going to go 100% renewable, and then yesterday, then there's a joint statement that comes out between the mayors of Paris and Pittsburgh saying that we're committed to protecting the climate. So I think that opens up a lot of opportunities. And now we have 30 cities in the U.S. that are committed to 100% renewable. We've got 3 states that are committed to that. But the opportunity here is around how it's done, right? How can we implement those policies that are being put in place? Because I don't think a lot of the cities have the roadmap of how they're going to get there. And it can be done the wrong way, right? It could be another corporate giveaway, right? Or it can be done with coalitions that are built between community, environmental justice, frontline communities, labor, and other sectors of these cities to be able to do that. And so I think that's where we have our opportunity. So we published this paper that Howard was just talking about. It's Jobs for Climate and Justice, a worker alternative to the Trump agenda. And we wrote this in anticipation of Trump putting out his infrastructure proposal. And we knew it was, we knew what we could expect from a Trump proposal on infrastructure. And I don't know if folks have seen Bernie Sanders' piece that he just put out about the infrastructure bill, how it's basically incentivizes corporations to buy up infrastructure and develop our infrastructure, but then it privatizes them so that they can charge fees and tolls and all of these kind of things. So it's another example of a corporate giveaway that we could face, and that it doesn't work. Right? And he gives an example, in fact, here in Chicago, of how that hasn't worked. So we wrote this anticipating that proposal, and basically said what we need is a worker alternative, being a labor support movement organization, that's based on four principles. One is that we have to invest in the transition to a fossil-free economy to provide good jobs for all. So obviously we have to create good quality work. Second is that we have to protect threatened workers and communities. So for those folks that are going to lose their jobs in the transition out of the fossil fuel economy, we have to protect those workers. And then third is remedy inequality and injustice. So some of the things that Howard was speaking to, how do we, as we create these jobs, how do we allow for those communities that haven't had access to the good paying jobs to be able to do that? That's one of the dimensions of it. And then lay the basis for a new economy. So we know it's going to have to be more transformative than just closing down fossil fuel refineries and coal plants. So those are the four principles. And what the paper does is it actually gives examples of organizing work that's going on around the country that are kind of the foundation for what this could look like. So we have examples of where folks have transitioned out of, shutting down coal plants. Places like Tonawanda, New York, where there was a just transition agreement that was negotiated by unions and environmental justice groups that provided for revenues for those communities to continue to get the benefits as the coal plant shut down. Also in San Luis Obispo, there was a partnership between Friends of the Earth, IBW, the Brotherhood of Electric Workers, the utility, and the city to plan for transition there, providing $350 million for workers during the duration of the shutdown of the plant, and also revenues continuing to go to the city from the utility as the plant is shutting down. So there's those examples. How to provide, we actually cite Illinois and the act that was passed here for future energy jobs as another example, and the worker groups like the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization to get programs for low-income communities and communities of color for training and job creation as Illinois starts to transition to cleaner energy. So anyway, so just wanted to note that and encourage people to go to our website and take a look at the report, and definitely would be interested in people's feedback on the contents of the report as well. And then also just want to refer people to some of the other resources that we have at the Labor Network for Sustainability. We publish a number of reports. Some of the history that I talked about in terms of just transition is in a document called Just Transition, Just What Is It? So you can see some of the background of how the term and the evolution of just transition has happened over the past several years. So anyway, why don't I just go ahead and pause there, and we can open it up for discussion and any questions that folks have, and go from there. Thanks.
I'm not really supposed to ask questions, but can you explain why the Paris Agreement is bad? It was not good?
Yeah, so I gave you a couple of examples of that. One of it, it wasn't a binding agreement, and basically the real teeth were to set targets, right? About a 1.5 degree increase. That's the allowable limit that they want to shoot for. That's the goal. The actual, what they said they were committing to was a 2 degree, and this is 2 degrees Celsius increase, right? But basically, it's left up to each country to figure out how they're going to meet those goals, and there's no mechanisms for accountability other than really peer pressure for them to meet those goals. And part of the reason why it was weak was basically to appease the United States, right? Because the United States didn't want teeth into the agreement. So even when Trump says that, it's a bad agreement, it's a bad agreement largely because the United States, didn't want it to be. So that's one example. And then the other is also the fact that, again, it's based in, it's creating carbon markets, which haven't proved to be a solution. So, neoliberal policies have play a big role in getting us to where we're at today, and they're not going to be a solution to get us out of the crisis. Yeah.
Yeah, so like you said, it's not just about the transition from fossil fuels. There's a larger story that it's part of about automation and losing manufacturing jobs that whatever Trump says aren't coming back. Certainly not in the same form anyway. I'm from Pittsburgh, and my gut reaction when I heard Trump say that was like, has he been to Pittsburgh lately? Like since I've been born? Because my mother had, when she could remember, she died in November, but anyway, she could remember when people had soot, around their nostrils. I mean, what I remember is when all the buildings changed from black to beige when they steam cleaned them after the air quality regulations went through in the early 60s. But, Pittsburgh's economy Pittsburgh's the one Rust Belt success story. That's why I was, thinking that he hadn't been there.
Right.
But what's happened, I mean, it hasn't been without cost. My father was a sheet metal worker, so we went through the downturn of the manufacturing economy in Pittsburgh. He was out of work my senior year in high school, and I think a lot of the people of my generation left. But then, now it's the economy there is very strong now. It's based on the universities as the economic engines, and you've got robotics, and you've got medicine, and you have this whole, upper middle class, upper class professionals that moved in, and like the rest of the country, the economy's bifurcated. There's, the good middle class manufacturing jobs went away. You've got jobs in the service economy on one hand, and then you've got professional jobs on the other. And I've been to, there's a solar plant in Pullman here in Chicago, and I remember touring that, and they said to us, well, like, there's one person that's working there, because they just need one person to maintain the solar panels and make sure they're turned the right way and stuff. So you're right, that doesn't replace the steelworker jobs that were lost, but like I said, it's part of this larger story. And one of the things you said was having a guaranteed income, which I think is anathema to a lot of people that seem to be determining electoral politics. And so I don't know. So what do we do?
Well, that's a good point. One of the things that we're seeing, and I forgot who we were in conversation with the other day, but for this, what we want to be implemented requires a government that wants to do it. And what we're seeing more and more, in Europe and in the United States, is that, the right is in power, and governments that are anathema to this kind of program. But I think the other thing that's also clear is that that politics are becoming more polarized everywhere, right? So as we're seeing the rise of the right in a number of countries, we're also seeing like the emergence of a much more progressive left movement as well, right? And so, we saw that with this last election, right, where you can get Trump on one end, and then the Sanders campaign were openly talking about social democracy, right, and socialism. So the political spectrum and the range of political conversations we can have is opening, right? And there's movements growing on both sides. What we just saw in Britain, right, where Theresa May was won on the whole Brexit agenda, and then now the left and Jeremy Corbyn, they basically created a stalemate now in the parliament in the United Kingdom. So, and that's happening in a number of the industrialized countries right now. So to me, there's opportunity there too, right? And if we can provide a vision that's compelling to people, I think it's showing that people will rally around that. But it has to be more than just, asking people to take a leap of faith. There has to be some real policy behind it that says this is what we can and will do once we're in place. But no doubt about it, we're in a tenuous situation here in the United States. We've got 25 states with trifectas, of the right. So they control the governors, both houses of the legislature in 25 states. 6 more, they can call for a constitutional convention, right? And then we could be in trouble for a real long time. So it just really speaks to the need for us to be organizing and building coalitions, because that's really the only way out of it. There's no shortcuts. We need to organize.
Well, yeah, you're saying then we have conversations where people who think they're on opposing sides can talk to each other, and that's
I still believe in that, but there are some where it's just like there's no room for a conversation. The way it is now, obviously, with the internet. And one of the things that the right did was that they built up the academic construct for their positions, right? If you look over the last 30 years, this was very intentional. Now you see like a Patriot's History of the United States. I don't know if people have seen that book, and a lot of the references, the citations are within the last 30 years because they built up this whole body. And you go on the internet, you can find for any position you want to take, you can find the first 5-10 references will back up your position. And and obviously now we've got the Breitbarts and the Fox News and alt facts, and so it's a very challenging environment to get like real information. So yeah.
So you and thousands of other people were about to go to the People's Summit a couple miles away in McCormick Place. I was there last year. There were 3,000 people there, and a lot of young people, including people of color. Just to go a short story, two guys were sitting next to me, two Chicanos from LA and San Diego. They had actually written a letter to the commandant of the only remaining naval training base in the United States, here in Great Lakes, to ask to go to the summit, and they got permission. But the summit turned into one thing, and that was getting everyone to try to work within the Democratic Party to get elected. I don't know if this year's summit's going to be any different, and so a lot of those young people were very disappointed because they wanted to do more than just work within the Democratic Party. And the reason I'm telling this story is because I think it has a lot to do with the work that you're doing, which I think is incredibly important. I just want to thank you for not just what you're doing now, but what you did in Climate Justice Alliance and SWAP and all the other great stuff you've done. I think you've been a real inspiration. And the problem I think we have is that the environmental justice groups, as well as other progressive groups, have to deal with this paradigm because it's the dominant paradigm. And to give some concrete examples, there's somebody that you know well, I won't mention, in San Diego, who said, if you take those jobs that are green jobs, real green jobs, that have specific even percentages, like affirmative action for people of color in California or anything else, as long as carbon trading or nuclear is involved, it's like taking blood money. That's exactly what happened here in December with the example you gave. The big greens dominated that whole thing, and there was tremendous resistance from not just LDJO, but other groups, saying we shouldn't give in to ComEd to basically keep their 2 nuclear power plants in order to get a few jobs. Now, the jobs are absolutely important, but that's what happened here, and I think that's a real problem, because if we try to work with what we're going to get passed in Springfield as the primary thing, versus mobilizing the masses to get our own agenda, and then force the people in Springfield or Sacramento or wherever to do it, that's a very different approach strategically. And I hope that everybody who's involved in this, from the justice sector, particularly the racial and gender justice sector, really looks at the second thing as being primary, is mobilizing the masses. Another example is privatization versus public sector. The big greens, they don't care if things are privatized. They just want solar panels up.
That's right.
So the model now, as you know, that's dominant in the Southwest and California, is now all the big utilities are jumping into solar, and people are now going to be solar tenant farmers. There's already tens of thousands of people in California who've had solar put on their roofs by big and small companies, and they get none of the benefits of that, except probably a decreased energy bill. It all is going to make utility companies or startups bigger. So I think that's a huge issue. That also brings in the issue of electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are a completely false solution, and it's been proven that they actually can create more pollution, because where's the end of the plug? Where's the energy coming from? There's several studies done by states that show that individual cars, where 81% of the time one person's driving them, are not energy efficient, whereas public transit, like you said, is the way to go. And the last thing is basically this issue of race and gender. I think that the people that you and myself and a lot of people in this room hopefully are working with, we have to develop an agenda that's outside the traditional labor politics and get as many labor people to buy into it as possible. And I hope that's what's going to happen, because I think, trying to go, with the Blue-Green Alliance and all those groups, it's just not going to go anywhere, because they're not going to deal with these issues of race and gender in terms of jobs. I mean, they're not going to give in much.
I agree with all of that. I think.
I mean, it's tough. I'm not trying to say it's easy, but I think the main thing is we've got to develop our own agenda. And yes, we should get progressive Democrats on board, several of which exist in California and other places.
Well, so yeah.
But not primarily develop an agenda based on the strategy of what we're going to get passed at this moment, whether it's in Washington, Springfield, Sacramento, wherever.
Yep, absolutely. The question for us is how we build power, right? And part of the reason why we're caught in these positions is because we don't have the power to change the dynamics around the table, right? I mean, that's the bottom line. So, you know, and so these big environmental organizations are big, well-funded organizations, and some of them can claim membership of millions of people, right? And so when small, you know, environmental justice organizations are at the table with them, you know, it's we got an uphill battle. And then, you know, the utilities that, you know, like you cited in the Southwest, of course they're going to do that, right? For them, their strategy, their political and economic strategy is going to be, okay, we need to get ahead of this and make sure that we're going to be able to maximize our profits as these new industries are emerging. So, of course, you know, we can't expect them to do anything different, right? Until we organize enough people power to do that. Same as with the Democratic Party, right? We can't expect the Democratic Party to change. We can't expect to build an alternative to the Democratic Party unless we are building and organizing ourselves. So really, that's the challenge for us. In terms of the agenda within labor, and yeah, we're very clear within LNS about the challenges within the labor movement, and that's why LNS was actually founded, was because of that. You know, and Joe Uline was very clear. It's like, look, there are limitations to what we can do within the labor movement because of these questions. And if you go to the website, LNS is based on an analysis, a landscape and a power analysis of the labor movement. And there are examples in there of where has labor shifted on major issues, war, civil rights, et cetera. And it's only happened when there was a bottom-up approach to the labor movement. And that's why LNS was created to organize a bottom-up approach. Because we know, one of the things we do know is that there are a lot of people in the labor movement that do understand and care about these issues. So for us, a first task is how do we reach out and connect those folks and create a national vehicle for them to be able to support each other and organize within the labor movement. So that's the big challenge for us. So yeah, we know it's daunting, but like I say, there are no shortcuts around this. Until we actually build the power that we need, then we're not going to win in any of these areas. So that's why I think if we can provide that vision, and these coalitions can be built around a much more progressive agenda that is a racial justice agenda and a workers' rights agenda and a climate safe and sustainable and regenerative agenda. That's a vision I think people can get behind. I think more and more we're seeing that. So we got to make sure that we're building these coalitions in the right way.
Can you, I'd like to kind of, that was a great statement, right? Saying in a way I fucking taking us back into it. But, you know, with talking with Carlotta, for example, and things going on down in with the Holly Supai, and the effort now by big energy companies to do bring uranium back. Right? And, you know, again, the same lot of toxic, and some of the folks we work with, folks out of Laguna, for example, same thing experiencing the severe cancer and premature death due to contamination from uranium, right? But now they're talking about bringing uranium back and bringing it back to the bottom of the Grand Canyon.
Yeah.
So can you speak a little bit to not only the sort of Grand Canyon uranium, but the various indigenous struggles, because it seems like in the last few months we're seeing a big recommitment to the extractive industry. So on one hand, you're talking about the sort of transition out of it.
Yeah.
We're also seeing kind of, in some ways, this move back to it.
Yeah, it's
At the
yeah, it's
expense
really
of
unfortunate.
people of our community,
That's
especially
right.
indigenous.
So yeah, and then there are the two aspects to that, right? The effort to start mining and extracting in all of these different places again, and you know, and yeah, nuclear is it's a really dangerous, poisonous industry. At the same time that a number of nuclear plants are, you know, they're losing money and they're starting to phase them out. New York decided they're going to bail out their nuclear plants there, and there are 4 in the South that are being slated to are trying to get subsidies to stay open as well. We saw what happened with Fukushima, and what a lot of people don't, the story that's often not told is the impact on indigenous communities in the Southwest, the Navajo Nation and the uranium workers and the health effects that they're feeling to this day. So for us, I don't think that can be part of our vision moving forward, right? It's not a safe, it's like what you'd call a false solution. And then there's the aspect of indigenous people and sovereignty and rights and how those are consistently under attack, and we're seeing that more and more, with Standing Rock and Keystone XL, how this infrastructure is being built through indigenous communities, the tar sands in southern Canada and what the impacts are, and I mean it just goes on and on and on, how really North America is really being torn up for the infrastructure to build all of these pipelines. And indigenous communities oftentimes are standing in the way of that development. So Standing Rock was really a key moment, right? And I think within the labor movement, it was also a key moment because you had a number of unions starting to come out and supporting the Standing Rock tribe, a number of locals and constituency organizations within the AFL-CIO came out and openly, in defiance of the AFL-CIO's own position in support of the Dakota Access Pipeline, the constituency groups, which include, the Asian Pacific organizations like APALA and the Latino organizations like LACLA and A. Philip Randolph Institute, the African American constituency group, and on, they came out and said, no, we stand with Standing Rock. So even within the labor movement, this is becoming more and more polarized and tense, right? And the backlash from the other side, from the building trades, has also been fierce. And so, but I think for us, going back to where we're coming from as LNS, we're committed to the science, right? If the science is telling us we have to transition out, we have no choice. We've got to transition out of fossil fuels. And that's the commitment that the labor movement on. And second is we're committed to racial justice, we're committed to indigenous sovereignty and human rights. So for us, it is a question of which side of history are we on right now, right? And yeah, it leads to some unpopular decisions in different places with some of our own colleagues, but really in my view, we have no choice.
With the Paris Agreement being squashed by the president, what is the next solution? I mean, do you think he's going to come up with something to appease us, or is he going to let it go?
No. I think it was pretty clear. It was a commitment he made to the corporations and, unfortunately, some of the people in the labor movement in terms of jobs in the coal industry and others. So no, I think that was his intention all along. He has no interest in climate, and I think if you look at his track record up to now, of all the federal agencies and the budgets that he's cutting, the largest cuts are in the EPA. It's like the proposal is 31%, 1/3 of the Environmental Protection Agency he's proposing to cut.
But even scientifically, we know in the next couple of decades, if we don't fix this, it's going to be a problem. I mean, he is the president.
He's the president. And there are advisors in his own cabinet, including the Department of Defense, that are telling him this.
Right.
Yes.
So he's just not listening. Wow. That's crazy.
Who do you represent and who do you listen to?
Who you right.
Yeah, so yeah.
It is really ironic that he mentioned Pittsburgh, I think. Because if Pittsburgh hadn't transitioned out of steel, it wouldn't be the strong economy it is now.
Any other comments, thoughts?
Sorry, I missed your presentation, but I don't know if you addressed this before. Do you have any thoughts on how the transition to a clean economy is financed? Is there a role for pension funds, especially union pension funds?
Yeah, so there's a lot of, obviously there's a growing movement for divestment from fossil fuels. And so that is one source where a lot of the resources can come for the transition is through these divestment movements. And there are some efforts within the labor movement. One of our colleagues, Bob Mullenkamp, used to work with SEIU 1199, is somebody who's actively working on that and getting unions to divest their pensions from fossil fuels. So we're seeing that in places like San Francisco. There's a proposal in New York and in Maryland. And also, again, it's a matter of budget priorities, tax issues. As Trump is proposing to cut taxes again on the wealthy and create a wealth transfer from low and middle income people to the wealthy. I mean, that's money that should be used for a transition. So we need tax reform that actually brings resources back to the communities and away from folks that are profiting millions. I don't know if you saw, people saw recently, yesterday I think there was an article that came out about with the agriculture secretary, because obviously there's cuts also in the agriculture department that are being proposed. And he says, well, this is a way for us to show the American people that we can do more with less, right? And then the same day there's an article with Ivanka Trump about her $51,000 coat, and how it's like the whole luxury business is growing, because she's like this representative of that. So obviously not everybody's having to do more with less. It's just a matter of political priorities. And at the end of the day, even though the opportunities at the local, regional, and state level, we really are going to need a federal program. I mean, at the scale and the speed that we need to do this, we're going to need the national government to really to make the commitment politically and financially to do it. So while we're organizing at the local level, we can't lose sight of that. At the end of the day, that's where we need to head to. And then it's just a matter of shifting resources back to the people and away from the wealthy and corporations. And I just one note before I go back to you, but and then now the deregulation of Wall Street again, right? So the House just passed that bill to repeal Dodd-Frank, and we're going to see some of the same abuses within the financial system go even more unchecked than they've been. So.
Well, could you speak more about what organizing strategies that you feel work?
Mm-hmm. Well, so one thing in the United States in the last couple of decades is that we've gotten very good at mobilization, right? And then like these new forms of people coming together, like Occupy Wall Street, and Indivisible. So a lot of self-organization, which is positive. But in terms of how we sustain actual organizing and building organizations, I don't think we've been as good at that. Like, how do we actually continue to build those bases and build power at the local level? So there, I come out of a community organizing tradition that was, very much about identifying and working with leadership in the community and continuing to build that base, identifying and developing new leaders. I think we've gotten away from that in a sense. I think there is a positive aspect in the fact that this generation now, we have a very conscious generation of young people and activists that's bigger than my generation. I was kind of come out of a bridge generation between the 60s and 70s, and then, which was also a big active generation politically, and then my generation was less so, right? So we did a lot of good, I think, in terms of community organizing and union organizing over these years, but now the potential base of young people that are getting active, I think, is really promising. So I think if, bringing back some of those organizing principles that help to build strong organizations, I think is really critical, and tying that to, some of these new methods of how people are self-organizing. So I think somewhere in there, I think there's a lot of opportunity. And we can't ignore building electoral power. For whatever we feel about the United States electoral system, the fact that Donald Trump got elected with less than a majority of the popular vote, and the legacy of how this electoral system came into being is that we can't ignore it, and we have to work with it. The fact that they're trying to continually cutting voting rights in this country, the fact that people of color more and more are losing those rights to vote, I think that those are things that we have to resist, and we have to figure out how we're building electoral power to win some of these policies. So.
I'll make a comment.
has some occasional discussions about these topics in Washington DC with leaders of the climate justice and environmental and labor movement and other people who are at the table, hopefully more often, are people who work in the democracy movement. And one of the factors that we know about, and this isn't a conversation about that, is the way we allow money rather than votes to determine who's elected. So another part of this whole puzzle for us is the democracy movement. And, Keith Ellison is a champion of that movement and was moved out of leadership in the Democratic Party. It was a concerted effort by the leadership to keep him out. And then the other aspect is that there's a real brilliant effort by the right wing to tell a story, to control the frame. So
Yes.
when we do our organizing, we need to have
Right.
popular education where we're in
Yes.
rooms where people are discovering for themselves whether what they're hearing in the media is true.
Right.
And
Well,
it's
and maybe-
mostly not, because it's another frame that's not.
Yeah, and I noticed when you were talking, you were making historical connections that people don't usually make.
Yeah.
And I like George Lakoff's work. I've been a fan of Lakoff since he came out with his stuff. And he's argued that, it's that the conservatives have been better at controlling the frame for public discourse than the progressives
We
have.
need to make that part of our organizing
Absolutely.
better than we do.
Yeah.
That is one thing that LNS has always paid attention to since the beginning, is when there's a major life-changing event like Hurricane Katrina or an effort to get rid of the clean air regulations in California, we publish stuff that talks about those issues with a different tone, that speaks to the self-interest of workers and impacted communities. And that is a big part of the organization.
So many years ago, Michael and I and another woman named Jean Gauna, great organizer, founder of Southwest Organizing Project, we spent many nights talking about globalization, hanging around talking about globalization. And dear Jean has passed, we think of her often. But one of the things that Jean always asked, the comment she always made, was who pays, who benefits.
Yeah, exactly.
And that still continues to be the questions we get asked, and those who pay ought to be sharing in some of that benefit. Michael, this has been tremendous. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hope it was helpful.